My name is Megan Harper, and for most of my life, I have been the person who holds everything together. At 42, I'm a registered nurse in a busy metropolitan hospital, working 12-hour shifts in the ER, coming home to a tidy one-bedroom condo that I bought with my own savings. I don't have children, I don't have a husband. What I did have, until very recently, was a deep-seated belief that family means sacrifice. That if someone you love is drowning, you throw them the only life jacket you have, even if it leaves you treading water. That belief almost cost me the one thing that truly felt like home, Aunt Clara's cottage by Lake Harmon. Aunt Clara was my mother's older sister, a childless widow who spent 50 years turning a modest 1940s log cabin into a sanctuary. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, pine walls that smelled of decades of wood smoke, a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, and wide windows that looked out over water so calm it reflected the sky like a mirror. There was a small dock where we fished for bluegill as kids, a pebble beach where we skipped stones, and a screened porch where Aunt Clara served iced tea and told stories about the war years, about meeting her husband at a USO dance, about planting the sugar maple that now shaded half the yard. I spent every summer there from age 8 to 18. When my mother worked double shifts as a waitress, Aunt Clara became my second parent. She taught me how to bake blueberry pie with lattice crust, how to bait a hook, how to sit quietly and listen to loons at dusk. When she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at 82, I took family leave, moved into the cottage, and cared for her until the end. I held her hand as she slipped away, whispering that the lake looked especially beautiful that evening. 3 months later, at the reading of the will, the lawyer slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter from Aunt Clara. To my dear Megan, you gave me the gift of not dying alone. The cottage is yours, free and clear. Love it, live in it, pass it on to someone who will love it the same way. The deed was in my name alone. No one contested it. My mother cried happy tears. My sister Laura, who had visited Aunt Clara exactly twice in those final years, hugged me and said, "She always loved you best." For the first 2 years, I kept the cottage as a retreat. I'd drive up on long weekends, open the windows to air out the pine scent, sit on the dock with a book, and feel my blood pressure drop 10 points. I paid the property taxes, $5,800 a year, and the insurance. I replaced the roof when hail damaged the shingles. I had the septic tank pumped. It was my place of peace. Then Laura's life fell apart. She had married Greg right out of art school, a charismatic guitarist with big dreams and zero follow-through. They had Lily within a year, Noah 2 years later. Laura tried to make a living selling watercolor prints online, but the market was brutal. Greg bounced between bar gigs and day labor. They lived in a string of cheap rentals, always one missed paycheck from disaster. 10 years ago, in early spring, Laura called me at 2 a.m., sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "Meg, the landlord changed the locks. We're in a motel with the kids. Greg's paycheck bounced. We have $47 in the bank. Please, we have nowhere to go." I was at the motel by dawn. Lily, then 4, was curled on the bed in her dinosaur pajamas. Noah, 2, was burning with a fever. Laura looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Greg sat in the corner staring at his phone. I made the offer before I could think too hard. "You can move into the cottage, rent-free, just until you're back on your feet. Pay the utilities, keep up the yard, treat it gently, and when I want a weekend there, you'll make room." Laura fell into my arms crying. "You're our guardian angel, Meg. We'll be out in a year, tops, I swear." Greg shook my hand and said, "We won't let you down." They moved in that May. The first summer was almost idyllic. Laura sent photos, the kids splashing off the dock, Greg grilling trout he'd caught, Laura painting the sunset from the porch.
I visited in July, brought groceries and new life jackets, fixed the loose boards on the dock myself. They thanked me profusely. Year 2, the utility bills started arriving in my name because they'd forgotten to transfer them. I paid to avoid shutoffs. Year 3, the dock began to sag dangerously. I paid $4,200 to have it rebuilt. Year 4, the chimney filled with creosote and became a fire hazard. I paid $1,800 for cleaning and repairs. Year 5, the well pump failed, $6,300. Year 6, the sugar maple dropped a massive limb onto the roof during a storm, $9,800. Year 7, the septic system backed up into the yard, $11,000. I never asked for a dime. Every time I brought up money, Laura would cry and say, "We're trying, Meg. The kids need therapy, school supplies, dental work." Greg would promise the next gig would be the big one. Meanwhile, my own life moved forward. At 38, I met David, a paramedic with kind eyes and a quiet sense of humor. We fell in love over shared night shifts and bad hospital coffee. We started talking marriage, children. David loved the cottage the first time I brought him there. We spent weekends kayaking, making love by the fireplace, planning a future where our kids would learn to swim off that same dock. But every time we arrived, the place felt less like mine. Toys strewn across the porch, Laura's half-finished canvases everywhere, the pine walls scuffed and dirty, the kitchen counters perpetually sticky. The guest bedroom, once my sanctuary, now permanently occupied by the kids' overflow. When I gently asked them to tidy up before we arrived, Laura would snap, "This is our home, Megan. We live here." One Labor Day weekend, we drove up unannounced for a quick overnight. The cottage was locked, a note on the door, "Gone to Greg's gig in Traverse City. Back Monday." No apology, no offer of the key. That was the first crack in my patience. David and I talked late into that night at a roadside motel. "It's been 8 years, Meg. They're not leaving voluntarily. This isn't a temporary stay anymore." He was right. I began to see the pattern. Every improvement I paid for became another reason they couldn't move. The new dock meant the kids were finally settled. The repaired roof meant they couldn't uproot the children now. At year 9, David proposed on the Pebble Beach at sunset. I said yes. We started planning a small wedding at the cottage the following summer. I called Laura with the news, excited to share. "That's wonderful," she said flatly. Then, "But you're not expecting us to move out for the wedding, right? The kids' schools." That was the moment the dam broke. "Laura," I said, voice shaking, "this was never permanent. You promised a year. It's been almost a decade. David and I want to start our life there." Silence. Then tears. "How can you do this to us, to your niece and nephew? We have nowhere to go." "You've had 9 years rent-free on lakefront property," I replied. "That's over $250,000 in today's rental market. You could have bought your own place twice over." Greg got on the phone. "You're jealous because we have a family life here and you don't." I hung up. The war began. Laura mobilized the family. Our mother called daily, pleading, "She's your little sister. You can't put them on the street." Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years sent messages calling me selfish. Laura posted carefully worded Facebook updates about losing the only stable home her children have ever known, without naming me directly. Mutual friends unfollowed me. I gave them 18 months written notice, far more than the legal 30 days required for month-to-month tenants. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. I attached an itemized spreadsheet, $97,400 in taxes, insurance, and repairs I'd paid over 10 years. Laura's response was to change the locks. I discovered this when David and I drove up for a planned weekend. My key didn't work. Greg answered the door, smirking. "We needed better security. You'll have to call ahead from now on." I called a lawyer the next day. The legal process took 14 months. Laura hired a tenant rights attorney who argued equitable estoppel, that my years of paying expenses had led them to believe the cottage was permanently theirs. My attorney countered with bank records, tax payments, text messages where I repeatedly referred to it as temporary. The judge ruled in my favor. Possession returned to me in 90 days, with sheriff assistance if necessary. The final 90 days were hell. Laura stopped answering calls. When I sent a property manager to inspect, Greg threatened to call the police for trespassing. They hosted loud parties on the dock, posted videos online of the kids jumping into the lake, with captions like, "Making memories in our forever home." The yard became overgrown. The sugar maple dropped unchecked branches. I didn't visit again until moving day. I hired a professional moving company on standby and arrived with the sheriff's deputy at 8 a.m. sharp. Laura opened the door in pajamas, eyes red from crying or lack of sleep. The kids hovered behind her, confused. Greg was nowhere in sight. Laura's response was to change the locks. I discovered this when David and I drove up for a planned weekend. My key didn't work. Greg answered the door, smirking. "We needed better security. You'll have to call ahead from now on." I called a lawyer the next day. The legal process took 14 months. Laura hired a tenant rights attorney who argued equitable estoppel, that my years of paying expenses had led them to believe the cottage was permanently theirs. My attorney countered with bank records, tax payments, text messages where I repeatedly referred to it as temporary. The judge ruled in my favor. Possession returned to me in 90 days, with sheriff assistance if necessary. The final 90 days were hell. Laura stopped answering calls. When I sent a property manager to inspect, Greg threatened to call the police for trespassing. They hosted loud parties on the dock, posted videos online of the kids jumping into the lake with captions like, "Making memories in our forever home." The yard became overgrown. The sugar maple dropped unchecked branches. I didn't visit again until moving day. I hired a professional moving company on standby and arrived with the sheriff's deputy at 8 a.m. sharp. Laura opened the door in pajamas, eyes red from crying or a lack of sleep. The kids hovered behind her, confused. Greg was nowhere in sight. "You don't have to do this today," she whispered. "Give us one more month." "The judge gave you 90 days, the deputy said gently. "Time's up." They had done almost no packing. The movers began boxing belongings while Laura sat on the porch steps, sobbing. Lily, now 14, screamed at me, "I hate you! You're ruining our lives!" Noah, 12, just stared at the lake with silent tears. By evening, the cottage was empty of people but full of chaos. When I walked through alone after the movers left, the destruction hit in waves. They had trashed it. Every wall had holes, some fist-sized, some deliberate gouges. The pine paneling Aunt Clara had oiled lovingly every spring was scratched and gouged with keys. The stone fireplace was smeared with what looked like ketchup and mud. The kitchen cabinets hung open, shelves stripped. The refrigerator stood open and unplugged, spoiled food rotting inside. The bathroom reeked. They had poured paint remover down the toilet and sink, etching the porcelain. The screened porch, my favorite place, had every screen slashed. The sugar maple had fresh axe marks deep into the trunk, as if someone had tried to kill it. The dock planks were pried up and tossed into the lake. Worst of all, on the living room wall, someone had spray painted in dripping red, "Thanks for nothing, Megan." I stood in the middle of the wreckage and cried. Not pretty tears, but ugly, shoulder-shaking sobs. For Aunt Clara, for the summers that would never smell the same, for the sister I thought I knew. David arrived an hour later, took one look, and held me until I could breathe again. The cleanup and restoration took 8 months and $68,000, money we had saved for our wedding and honeymoon. We hired contractors to repair walls, refinish floors, replace plumbing fixtures, rescreen the porch. We had the sugar maple evaluated by an arborist. It survived, but scarred. We pulled the ruined dock planks from the lake bed and rebuilt it stronger. We postponed the wedding, but moved in the following spring. David and I sanded and restained the pine walls ourselves, bringing back the warm, honey color Aunt Clara loved. We planted new perennials along the walkway. We hung new screens and sat on the porch drinking iced tea, listening to loons again. We married quietly on the dock that summer, just 20 friends and a justice of the peace. I wore a simple white sundress. David wore linen. Lily and Noah weren't invited. Laura and Greg rented a small apartment 2 hours away. Last I heard, Greg left her for a younger woman in his new band. Laura waitresses nights and paints when she can. The kids are in therapy. She sent one letter 6 months after the eviction. I hate what we became. I'm sorry for the damage. I was scared. I didn't reply. 2 years later, I'm 44. David and I have a daughter now, Clara, named for the woman who taught me what home really means. She's learning to walk on the rebuild dock, giggling as minnows dart around her toes. The sugar maple leaves out fuller than ever, as if determined to heal. Some evenings, I sit on the porch with little Clara asleep against my shoulder and David grilling fish. The lake reflects the sunset like glass. The pine walls smell of wood smoke and lemon oil. And I understand something Aunt Clara knew all along. A home isn't just walls and water. It's boundaries held with love. It's choosing who gets to share your peace and having the courage to protect it when they stop deserving it. I was the fixer for too long. Now I'm the keeper. And the cottage by the lake, it's home again. Truly, finally, irrevocably home.